This episode is brought to you by the Sterling Soap Company. Christmas will be here before you know it. And you know what would make a great stocking stuffer for everybody in your family? Sterling Soap. From bar soap to shave soap, beard balm to lip balm, aftershaves and lotions, Sterling Soap has something for everyone on your list. Check out their seasonal soaps that will complement the scents of your home this holiday season. And they're more than just soap. They also have a full line of coffee straight from the Sterling Roastery. Find their full line of products at sterlingsoapcompany.com.
Looking for the perfect gift for that basketball fan in your life? Well, I've got a book for you. It's called Basketball Now. Newly updated for 2025, it spotlights 50 of the NBA's top stars. Think fast breaks, clutch threes, and buzzer beaters. Captured in stunning photography with sharp, readable analysis. From rising stars to veteran icons, this book is a courtside pass to the game right now. Wrap up a slam dunk this holiday season and pick up your copy of Basketball Now today at your favorite bookseller. This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
They ran a perfect, absolutely perfect post corner route to Stephen Storing. Eason overthrows him by 5 yards.
Yes, and like what you mentioned, a lot of things had gone differently. And once again, this is where you I differ at, because at times, you can kind of think much more in depth about things than I do, and then the inverse is true when it comes to other things. This is one of them instances where I think, I'm not going to say you're overcomplicating it, but you just in the little rundown you had, it was just an obvious recurring theme that you had. Tony Eason. That's all you need to know.
Sports from back in the day. From Atlanta, it's Dana on the mic, talking old school legends, bringing history to life. We go deep like a spiral in the Superdome, back when athletes left the game due to talking alone. Jordan fadeaways, Jackie in the zone, Ali in the ring, man, he stood all alone. From the Negro Leagues to the ABA, we break it all down, the classic way. It's Charles from the district, straight out the boot. Southern University pride, rapping truth in the booth. From Baton Rouge to the nation's capital, legends on deck. Yeah, we factual, tales of the greats, gold chains and all. Baseball, who dreams in that football brawl? No clickbait, no fluff, just the facts we say. It's historically speaking sports from back in the day. So sit back, tune in, and hit replay. It's historically speaking sports, the classic way.
Before the dynasties, before the banners, before Brady, before Belichick, and even before Bledsoe, there was the 1985 New England Patriots, a team built on grit, not glamour. History often remembers the champions, yet the 1985 New England Patriots didn't win a championship. Yet in this case, they are remembered for the journey, a journey that was one of the most memorable in NFL history. Hello once again, sports fans. This is Dana Augusta. I will be joined by my co-host Charles Combs once again, and you're listening to the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast, the place where we bring you the best of sports from back in the day. In this edition of the podcast, we will talk about the Patriots' first AFC Championship team that posted three postseason upsets, that including ending a losing streak that dated back to the Lyndon Johnson administration. This was a team that was devoid of big names and huge stars, but was comprised of several solid individuals that was the personification of blue-collar teamwork. Leading this group was a head coach who made his own way to Canton, Ohio as a Hall of Fame receiver, but his quiet, understated style was the trademark of this great team. Later in the show, we will send a shout out to a former Patriot great whose clutch performance that season made him a New England legend, plus a discussion on who was actually the worst Super Bowl participant. We have all that coming up and more on this edition of the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast here on the Sports History Network.
Hey there. Welcome to Music Meets Sports, where sports legends meet custom soundtracks. Founded by music producer Ronald Tyke Oliver, Music Meets Sports was created to bridge generations, educate fans, and celebrate the greatness of both current and former athletes. We craft original songs about heroes in basketball, football, baseball, boxing, and beyond, highlighting their struggles and victories. Across all musical genres, we reintroduce fans to their favorite athletes in a way they've never heard before. From Babe Ruth to Reggie White, from rising WNBA stars to timeless NFL great stream, or download our music now on Apple Music, Amazon, and Spotify. Visit musicmeetsports.org to explore the catalog, hear new releases, and join the movement that's preserving sports history, one song at a time.
And we're back here on the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast. I am your host, Dana Augustin, joined once again by my main man, my partner in sports crime, in sports history crime, I should say, Charles Combs. Chuck, how you doing on this bitterly cold December evening, a couple of weeks before Christmas?
Man, cold, brother. Definitely looking forward to flying to Louisiana next weekend to kind of get some warm weather and just kind of sit up here like try to stay warm like you, and then just kind of ready to kind of revisit the '85 Patriots today, man. So we can kind of turn over a few rocks and so forth, man. So let's go.
All right, so the reason why I picked this topic, and it's a very, very interesting reason I did this, and I heard somebody say this once on another podcast, and I thought that this would be a very interesting topic to talk about, because whenever you think of, or whenever you see on television, sometimes every now and then, they do like a video montage of the bad years of the Patriots. This is before the Bill Parcells, Drew Bledsoe era Patriots. This is like the 80s, like the early 90s Patriots. And they will always lump this team into that. They will always show like the scenes from Super Bowl 20 when they got destroyed by the Bears. And I thought that was kind of unfair. So, they will always lump these group of guys into that early 90s Patriots bad teams with the likes of Tommy Hodson and Hugh Millen and, Scott Zolak, when they were the quarterbacks there, which were god awful, even though Tommy Hodson's like a local hero to us from LSU. But still, those Patriots teams were really bad. But this is sort of like, the culmination of a franchise that was kind of on the rise in the early 80s when we talked about the NFL in the New England Patriots back then.
Yeah, they was pretty much a solid team, a team, to your point, that was on the upswing, and they do kind of get unfairly assessed due to the nature of the loss in Super Bowl 20 to the Bears, and then some of those dry subsequent years, like for example, like you mentioned earlier, that Pete Carroll era, and all of that, and they were really, really, really bad for a number of years, like from the late 80s through like the early 90s until Parcells kind of brought them back to respectability in the mid 90s.
And looking back on this team, there was a lot of things that doing research on this subject I've either did not know or just completely forgot about, especially some of the really great players that was part of this New England Patriots team in 1985. Some of the things that I remember, I want to get your memories of this team. From what I remember about this team was that there was just such of a physical ball club, which was so unlike most of the AFC teams, especially in the AFC East. They were very physical.
You had to, if you look at the overview of that division in 1985, I mean, the team that really ruled that division was the Dolphins with Dan Marino coming off of his what was it, 38 touchdown passes that, the year before. He had some
Yes.
remarkable season, leading into Super Bowl 19. You had the New York Jets with Ken O'Brien and Wesley Walls and Freeman McNeil. We're going to talk more about them later on. And then you had the Patriots, sort of like in the middle of the road. They were just like, there was nothing too overly glamorous about that team. There was nothing about that team that really stuck out to anybody. They was just this average team. And it just seemed like during the season that we're going to talk about later, they caught fire. And that fire continued all the way to New Orleans in Super Bowl 20.
Correct. And then at that time, to your point, they was a complete they were built completely different from the other AFC counterparts. And we're not really counting the Bills and the Colts at the time, because the Colts had just moved to Indianapolis from
Right.
Baltimore. And the Bills, outside of Joe Ferguson and Joe Cribbs, the Bills were just awful at
Yeah.
that time. And but they were just different. And then it just seems like they had like a lot of poor man versions of more well-known players. Like for
Right.
example, you had like someone like a Craig James, kind of, who was kind of like a poor man's Larry Zonka, so to
Yeah.
speak. Right, really physical in between the tackles, really good back, one half of that Pony Express backfield with Eric Dickerson at
Yeah.
SMU in college. And then you had people like Tony Collins, and then you had like Mosey to Poo Poo, who
Yeah.
could just do a little bit. He wasn't great in any particular area, but he could do several things solidly and well. But then you flip over to the defensive side of the ball. You got Andre Tippett, ironically, wore number 56. He was
Yeah.
kind of like a poor man's Lawrence Taylor, kind of. He
Yeah.
was like a poor man's LT. Not nearly as disruptive, but very, very good, very, very above average, and,
Yeah.
and, and was a playmaker.
Right. And you talk about playmakers on defense. I mean, you got that whole defensive unit, Ronnie Lepet, Maurice Claiborne. They was so important to the Patriots doing that long winning streak they had during the regular season, and especially in the playoffs. They were so clutch in the playoffs, their defensive unit, and it could be, and I could just that defensive unit and going into Super Bowl 20, you kind of thought that even with going up against the Chicago Bears, though I remember as a kid, when I was 13 years old, when Super Bowl 20 took place on January of 1986, I was 13. And I was just saying to myself, well, I was about to turn 13. Um, I was like, I can't see how the Patriots could even contend with the Bears, because you saw what the Bears did in the postseason that year, two shutouts in the playoffs going into the Super Bowl. And I think that they kind of took the Patriots sort of for granted, in the beginning, because I'm a one because if you looked at that game, and I remember this like it was yesterday, if you went back and looked at the first 5 minutes of Super Bowl 20, you really thought we may be seeing an upset here, because the way the game started exactly like the Patriots wanted to. Now, I'm gonna go back. We're gonna start with Super Bowl 20. I know that's kind of like, like out of order or whatever, but I want to get the really bad stuff out of the way first. Okay, as everybody knows, Bears won 46-10 in this game, and the Patriots seemingly was never in the game. But the first 5 minutes of the game may have made you think otherwise. Because let me give you a little rundown of what happened. Bears get the ball first. The second play of the game, Walter Payton, of all people, fumbles. Fumbles the football on the second play of the game and is recovered by Julius Adams, the longtime defensive end for the Patriots, who was playing in his last season. If I want to say it was his last game for the Patriots, he had been playing for the Patriots since the 70s, and he recovers a fumble. The first play of the offensive play for the Patriots, and I think might have been a harbinger of bad times, might have been like a bad omen for the Patriots. The very first offensive play, Eason throws a pass towards tight end Lynn Dawson. Dawson dives for the ball, incomplete, but he tears his ACL on the play. So there's a long delay to get him off the field. One of their key offensive weapons. 2nd and 10. They throw a little quick slant to Stanley Morgan. If the ball, Chuck, was maybe 6 inches further in front of him, that's 6. But the way the ball was thrown, Mike Singletary got just a fingernail on the ball to knock the ball out of Stanley Morgan's hands. 3rd down, they ran a absolutely perfect post corner route to Stephen Storing. Eason overthrows him by 5 yards.
Yes, and like what you mentioned, a lot of things had gone differently. And once again, this is where you and I differ at, because at times, you can kind of think much more in depth about things than I do, and then the inverse is true when it comes to other things. This is one of them instances where I think, I'm not going to say you're overcomplicating it, but you just in the little rundown you had, it was just an obvious recurring theme that you had. Tony Eason, that's all you need to know. Tony Eason, man, you know what I mean? So it's like, and then there was also like a sort of deal where obviously all year the Bears just seemed like a team of destiny. They had that 46 defense had really taken off, and then they had some larger than life personalities like the Fridge, Jim McMahon. They had Dan Hampton, Steve McMichael, Mike Singletary, Otis Wilson, Wilbur Marshall, Richard Dent, some larger than life personalities.
And Richard Dent was MVP.
Correct. But to me, it was always one of those games where for the Patriots to even be competitive, the Bears would have to play the absolute worst game possible. Usually with that 46 defense, they would need some help in those other phases, which you alluded to at the beginning, and they generated a turnover. But usually to flip these things in the other direction, you need things like a couple of non-offensive scores, like a defensive score, perhaps, of some type of play in the kicking game, or a Bears breakdown in the kicking game to kind of flip the game on its head a little bit. And I thought that devoid of any of that they didn't stand a chance against this game, because you mentioned earlier that they were very, very physical for the AFC East. But as you know, at this time, this was kind of like the second year of the NFC dominance, because you remember the Raiders won Super Bowl 18 over the Skins in an upset, by the way. But then the NFC ran a series of victories until the Broncos beat the Packers for the 97 season in the Super Bowl. Terrell Davis, John Elway, and all of it, Easy Ed McCaffrey, all of those guys. So it was like, even though they were physical for the AFC East, that was different than NFC's physicality, as well as Chicago Bear, Mike Dicker coach, Buddy Ryan coach physicality. Those are two totally different things.
Right. So the Patriots get a field goal, 3-0 early. And I went back and watched at least the first half. Well, most of the first half, as much as I could stomach watching that game again. They flashed the graphic right after Tony Franklin kicked the field goal. And the graphic on the screen was team scoring first had won 15 of the previous 19 Super Bowls. So they were trying to hype up maybe the upset, or at least hyping up the fact that it could be more competitive than people thought. And then the bottom fell out. Bears would score 44 unanswered points, ended up winning 46-10. Tony Eason, to your point, went 0 for 6. He is still the first and only quarterback ever to be benched in the Super Bowl. Now, I don't know how true this is, I had heard this story. I don't know how true it is. A part of me wants to believe it, and a part of me hope it's not true. But there was somebody on the offensive line of the Patriots. It might have been John Hanna. Who knows? I don't know who said it. I don't even know if it's really true. But I heard the story that said that if you put Tony Eason back in the game, I'm not sure if I'm going to block for him. That's how bad it got. He finished the game 0 for 6, did not complete a pass. Only starting quarterback in Super Bowl history not to complete a pass. And it was just, they didn't score again until late in the fourth quarter, essentially garbage time. Grogan comes in, throws a touchdown pass when the game was essentially, it made the score 44-10. The Patriots, I mean, the Bears would score a late safety, sacking Grogan in the end zone. So there you have it. That was a very unceremonial end to that Patriots season. But how they got here is a story in itself, and it's a very incredible story, I feel. And before we get into like the particulars of this team or anything like that, anything you wanted to add before we moved on?
Well, I would just say that it was just a tough matchup, and I would believe that that was said about Tony's, and I would tend to believe that because you remember at the time, because due to the ascension of Dan Marino, like most professional sports are a series of copycat leagues.
Yeah.
So with the ascension of Dan Marino, teams were trying to find a signal caller that could really make a lot of plays in the passing game and in all of that. So, like
Right.
for instance, the emergence of Ken O'Brien. Then, similarly, Easton was part of that famous 83 draft.
Yeah.
They were trying to get him because, even though Steve Grogan was a grizzled veteran, he was the type of quarterback that, okay, he can keep you in ball. He's not going to win a ball game, but he's not going to lose the ball game.
At least at that juncture of Grogan's career, he wasn't going to win a lot of games, but he's going to keep you in a game. He's not going to lose it. He's not going to lose the game for you, especially at that juncture of his career. And we're going to talk about him at length in a little bit in a little while. But from what I remember, Steve Grogan was a very, very solid quarterback, even at that age. Because he had been in the league at that point for 11 years, and he was very solid, he didn't have the legs that he had at the beginning of his career. He wasn't like the scrambling quarterback like he was, but he was a very solid quarterback that will not lose a game for you, And as far as like part of that, quarterbacking class, I mean, you had, that was like the big thing, at that time was like all of the quarterbacks that came in the 83 draft. Eason was one of them. You had Marino. You had Elway coming on. Ken O'Brien was very solid for the Jets. And not to mention others. Like Todd Blackledge in Kansas City. Who was still sort of trying to find his way. But Tony Eason, I think. If you take all of those players that was in the 83 draft, or at least the quarterbacks, at least. How would you rank Eason? You think Eason was the worst of that bunch, or would you give it to somebody else?
I probably would rank him slightly ahead of Todd Blackledge because Eason, he actually had a lot of talent, but he was kind of because like a lot of times he would give you like a 350 game with 3 touchdowns, 4 touchdowns. But then conversely, he'll turn around and go 0-6 with a couple of turnovers. So he was kind of like a John Starks type of player or a Buster Douglas type of player. Like you don't know what the hell you're gonna get from game to game. You could get, like John Starks, he, similar to John Starks, he can't miss today. Then you'll come right back and you're like, well, damn, he can't even make a completion today. So I know it had to be very disheartening for his teammates and his comrades because he just did not know. Whereas even though Steve Grogan, he wasn't, the highs weren't as high, the lows weren't as low either. And he was kind of like steady Eddie. For the most part, you knew what you were going to get from week to week, so you could adequately game plan and you could have a reasonable expectation of how the game would go because you know what you're going to get out of the guy. But he was in that class where I think they just kind of some of those quarterbacks got inflated because everyone was trying to do that and change to a passing league. Because you remember similarly in Oakland, LA rather, with the Raiders, they had a similar problem. You had to establish veteran Jim Plunkett, but they just kept giving Mark Wilson chance after chance after chance. And the Raiders had a championship team, but he stunk.
Right. Yeah.
He stunk, but they felt that he could do more potentially, but
Yeah.
He wasn't steady Eddie. So it's the same thing. You don't know what the hell you was going to get.
Right. To adequately begin this story, you have to go back to the 1984 season, and the Patriots that year finished 9-7. They finished second place in the AFC East behind Miami, but wasn't good enough to make the playoffs. In middle of the year, they made a coaching change. They fired Ron Meyer, which was the head coach of SMU, during the Pony Express era with Craig James, who was on the Patriots team, who had came from the USFL, and Eric Dickerson, who was with the Rams. But Ron Meyer was the coach of the Patriots and was fired. And they turned to their former wide receiver coach, man by the name of Raymond Berry, who was a Hall of Fame wide receiver for the Colts in the 60s, 50s, late 50s, early 60s, to be the new head coach. Now, he did have a history with the Patriots because he was their wide receiver coach under going back to Chuck Fairbanks in the mid 70s and under Ron Earhart of the early 80s. But what was so interesting was the fact that a lot of the players did not really like Ron Meyer. Tony Collins, the running back of the Patriots running back, said, quote, Raymond Berry had earned more respect in one day than Ron Meyer earned in 3 years. And if you remember, Ron Meyer was more of a rah-rah type, but with a lot of rules and a very strict disciplinarian. Berry, on the other hand, was so laid back. I don't ever remember him yelling on the sidelines or anything like that. That just was not in his demeanor. I think that Berry would be a great coach now because he was a former player, understood how players thought, understood what players needed, and plus his quiet demeanor really helped that team out.
Yeah, and he had juice. He had juice. He had clout because not to go too far back, but we got to give the brother his credit now, because as a player, because like a lot of times they come with these receiver quarterback duos, the top 10, for some weird reason, which is just totally crazy to me. Unitas the Berry never appears in those lists. And, the man was a Hall of Famer and, Hall of Famer, 1950, all-decade team. And the man helped pioneer two integral components that are still very prevalent in pro football. Now, the man, he and Johnny Unitas, they pioneered the timing pattern, which they still do. He in the greatest, the 57 championship game against the Giants? 58. They brought out the 2-minute drill, which they still do. You know what I mean? And it's just like, so I'm just saying, dog, put some respect on his name. Now, let's go back to him as the coach. Due to all of that, as well as his ascension in the coaching ranks, he had earned a lot of respect. He had earned a lot of clout. So, especially at that time, a lot of these guys, they knew who he was. They were well aware of him. Some of them their parents probably even grew up listening to the radio for of his games, or even watching TV. So he had a lot of clout. So, like, football is a game where, and we're both like this. It's easy to take advice from somebody. Like, you come talking to me, you better damn sure make sure you're hooping if you come talking to me. Like, if you haven't scored a bucket all day, then you got all the advice in the world. It's like, well, hell, if you knew everything, why the hell you ain't got a bucket yet today?
Right.
You know what I mean?
Exactly.
So I'm thinking that he resonated with the players because to your point, he understood the psyche of players. He understood what the players needed, as well as, he didn't have to be as rah-rah because his name and his credentials spoke for themselves.
Exactly. That year in 1984, he took over. Now, Raymond Barry was completely out of football. He was actually a real estate agent. He was selling houses until the New England Patriots called him up and say, "Hey, we would like to have you as our head coach," because he did have a history with the team. The owner Billy Sullivan, who had owned the team since the beginning, since he basically founded the Patriots and part of the old AFL, called him up and say, "We need a coach. Would you be interested?" And he said yes. He jumped at the chance, took over after Ron Meyer was fired. And the Patriots responded, winning 4 of their last 8 games in 1984 to arrive at the record of 9-7. Of course, they missed the playoff that year. But moving into 1985, they were predicted to finish in the middle of the AFC East. You had the Miami Dolphins, who was in the Super Bowl the year before. You had an up-and-coming New York Jets team with a high-powered offense with Ken O'Brien. And, of course, you had the New York Sack Exchange, still causing, wreaking havoc, with Joe Klecko and Mark Gastineau and Marty Lyons and that bunch. And I look back at the Street and Smith 1985 Preview Magazine edition, and what they wrote about the Patriots was very interesting. They said, quote, the Patriots have a lot of good players, a lot of versatility, and a balanced attack. What they don't have is a defined personality. Okay. Then they went further and talked about they hired Raymond Barry. Ron Earhart was the coach before Ron Meyer, and players complained that he was too easy. Ron Meyer comes in, and the players complained, said that his nitpicky rules made it seem like he was a lifeguard at a Florida retirement community. So Raymond Barry comes in, and I think that he was a little bit of a compromise between Earhart and Meyer, is that he had the clout, like you said, and he had some rules. But at the same time, he had this very easygoing personality, and he had the clout and he had the experience of playing in the National Football League, which a lot of players gravitated to, basically to say, this guy's done it before. This guy knows what I'm feeling right now. This guy has played on the highest levels. He has won championship. He had won 2 NFL championships with the Colts in the late 1950s. So this guy knows how to get there, and he understands us. And I think that really helped them, especially with this New England Patriots team, who had an even mix of veteran players and young players. And as the season went on, they started to develop a personality that Street and Smith at the time really didn't see.
Precisely. And, to your point about Raymond Barry, they just kind of know what it takes. And then also, just to go back to Ron Meyer very briefly, and we'll put the nail in his coffin, like a lot of times where, people often talk about the huge transition from college to NFL from a player perspective,
Right.
but they don't tend to focus on that from a coach perspective, which may be even more drastic because, like in college, you're used to dealing with a bunch of young men, literally kids, where, to your point, those type of nitpicky rules and that strict regimen and so forth, it can carry some weight. Whereas, you're coming out of college as a coach going to a professional ball club, especially depending on the makeup of that club. If it's like a veteran laden, like they had like a nice mix of veterans and young players, but obviously with the veterans, they were the leaders of the locker room.
Right.
Some of those antics, obviously, they're not going to go over as well because we're grown men. We're not a bunch of kids, you know. So, and then, it's just like, Barry was a breath of fresh air because, to your point, he had done it before. He knew what it took, you know what I mean? And he believed in his ball club and all of that. And then he just coached them. He just coached them in a way like, okay, they kind of had some talent, no identity, but you know, let's not beat ourselves. They didn't
Right.
have no particular dominant staples or anything, but let's not beat ourselves. Let's just try to at least force the opponent to beat us. If the opponent can play out hit us, out block us, out tackle us, and just play a cleaner game and just beat us straight up on the basis of talent and coaching ability, that's a bit easier to accept than you're beating yourselves with untimely penalties, putting the ball on the ground, and lack of execution.
Well, 1984, before we leave off of 1984, head to 85, the major problems with with the team was they had struggles along the offensive line. Of course, you had John Hanna there, and we're going to talk about him in a bit. But they had struggles along the offensive line. Tony Eason had just completed his first full season as the starting quarterback. 3,228 yards passing, 23 touchdown passes, but he was sacked 35 times. So if you drop him back and getting sacked, and of course we're talking about the early 80s, the mid 80s where you didn't throw the ball as much as you do now, getting sacked 35 times, that is a lot, and adding to the Patriots coaching staff was defensive coordinator Ron Rust, who was one of the really top defensive coordinators at the time, coming back to New England. And that was the first move that Ray Barry made, was to bring in Ron Rust. And he was the defensive coordinator. He was like one of the defensive coaches for those great late 70s Patriots teams that won the division in 78. They had that great run in 76 where they pushed the Raiders to the brink in the playoffs, So you have a lot of guys that's coming back to this Patriots team that had some success with them in the past, trying to rekindle that heading into 1985. But the biggest question in 1985, I think, the jury was kind of still out on Tony Eason. You still had Grogan as the backup, and this is something I think that you really don't see anymore. In fact, that if this was today, Grogan would have been on another team long before now, long before this case, because young quarterback comes in. I think Eason was like the 11th or 12th pick overall as a quarterback. You got the old wily veteran there. Some team would have picked him up to be their backup, to pretty much mind the store until they got themselves a quarterback. But with him being there still that's something that you just don't see anymore. Like a quarterback who had his time, who had success, had been benched for a younger player, but the quarterback is still there.
Correct. And definitely the case, because you mentioned like now, especially a quarterback that has been the start of the same franchise for a number of years and has earned respect and endearment from the fan base and
Right.
probably more importantly, the teammates as well. So if you bring in a new guy to kind of run the ship, but he still remains in like a backup capacity, sometimes that could create some looking over the shoulder. That can create some angst at
Yeah.
times because the second something goes wrong, the fan base, the teammates, and all that. Hey, let's get the old veteran in to kind of right the ship a little bit and all of that. So to your point, that is very uncommon now, and
Mm-hmm.
and pretty much uncommon period. But they for some reason they just kept Grogan around, which is kind of to me a clear indication of the sentiment of the organization that they were not sold on Eason, nor were they all in.
Right. You know, when Grogan was the quarterback, he was the starter since the mid 1970s. He had playoff appearances in 76, led them to a division title in 78. It was his 11th season in the league. And looking at this team, the passing game would be secondary, because Raymond Berry, even though he was a receiver in his career, that team, looking back at it, was ground oriented. And they had three key running backs on that team. Craig James, you alluded to, Tony Collins, and Mosi Tutupu. Those three guys, you want to talk about running back by committee. It was It was this right here. You really think about it, like offensively, there was no real. You had a couple standout players that as the season went became kind of standout, but they did not like they weren't like headline guys. They were really good players that were the focus of defensive game plans. But as far as like capturing the imagination of the American public outside of New England, you really didn't have it. This was basically essentially a lot like Barry, a very understated team. And a lot of times you see the team take on the personality of the coach. This team is by far the best example of that because this was just a solid club with not a lot of star power, but they just got it done.
Correct. And a lot of times that is exactly what you lead. And many times that can be enough for the
Yeah,
most part. Just like we keep mentioning, I know I keep harboring on the same thing. A lot of times just do your job. You don't
yeah,
necessarily, especially because you mentioned they had some explosiveness because you remember, Stanley Morgan had
yeah,
world class speed. So he could make a big play here and there. Then Irvin Fryer was relatively young at the time. He could make some big plays as well, but the combination of that, but as well as the uncertainty at the quarterback position and trying to
yeah,
minimize bad plays, trying to minimize mistakes, that just kind of led to everyone just kind of, okay, hey, just do your job. And once again, the same thing. Look, let's not beat ourselves. Let's just, attention to detail. Let's do what we're supposed to do. Let's do our jobs. No mental mistakes and no stupid mistakes as far as penalties, nor stupid turnovers. And with our defense, because I mentioned earlier, it was a lot of poor man versions of things, but they had a few very good players on offense. But consequently, they also had a lot of very solid, the good players on defense. So no, let's just kind of stay in the ball game a little bit
right.
and let's just see what happens.
Right. Craig James, gives you a little statistics on them. Craig James, 263 carries in 1985, 1,227 yards, only five touchdowns. Tony Collins, 163 carries for 657 yards and three touchdowns. And Mosi Tupu, 47 carries, 152 yards and two touchdowns. Like I said, running back by committee, you're not going to see a whole lot. They're not going to blow you away as far as, running statistics or anything like that. They were just, like you said, they just got the job done. And then you mentioned the receiving core. Stanley Morgan was the top receiver for that team. He had been Grogan's favorite target during the late 70s and those great Patriots teams of the late 70s. Stanley Morgan, that year he was in his ninth season out of Tennessee. 39 catches, 760 yards, and five touchdowns. But on the other side of the field was the young kid, the young cat Irving Fryer from Nebraska, one of my all-time favorite players. He was in his second year, 39 catches, 670 yards, and seven touchdowns. He made the Pro Bowl that year, and he was second team All-Pro at the receiver spot from the AFC. So you had some weapons, and again, it goes back to the quarterback position as far as like, you know, the kind of the uncertainty at the quarterback position. And it's like I said earlier, and like you've been alluding to, the jury was still out on Eason. And I can remember a lot of people thinking, okay, Eason, he was great at Illinois. He came into the league with the Patriots. He was in the right type of system, I think. That because I think if he would have went to like a team that threw the ball a lot, he would have been. It wouldn't have worked out. But he was like in a perfect system to be like a more of a system quarterback, and that's what I've always thought of him as more of a system quarterback. But this system just pretty much suited him. But I think that in the Super Bowl, especially with Eason, the moment might have been too big for him.
Correct. And then you also got to, in addition to the variables that we've kind of gone through in terms of the Patriots themselves, we also have to take into account the division because, like
Yeah,
a lot of times, teams, in most instances, teams draft and kind of build their ball clubs um, um, personnel wise, as well as schematically with their division rivals in mind.
Right.
So, playing this style of game with, limit the mistakes, run the football by committee, because, even though you mentioned all of the stats of the running backs, that's nearly 2,000 yards rushing per for the whole season. So that's a lot of production in a 16 game season, which
Yeah.
is paramount considering the division that they play in terms of they had 4 games total against both Marino and the Dolphins, as well as O'Brien and the Jets, who were both much more explosive offenses and high flying. So it was really imperative, to your point, can't get in the track meet with these guys. Let's shorten these games down a little bit.
Right.
Run the ball, move the chains, control the clock. Keep the opposing offense off the field. Defense is fresh. They can kind of go at them full gas all the time because we're controlling the ball game a little bit, which was a very, very solid approach.
Now, when we're talking about the Patriots offense, and I'll never forget my dad made a comment right before Super Bowl 20. He said that the Patriots are in bad shape. And I said, why? Why is their best offensive player an offensive lineman? Because their offensive lineman was John Hanna. In my opinion, the greatest offensive lineman of all time. When my son started playing football at 10 years old, they stuck him as an offensive lineman. And one of the things I told him was, you have to watch film on John Hanna. Eventually, he became a defensive lineman, so he started watching Aaron Donald and Vita Vea of the Buccaneers. But John Hanna was by far one of the greatest offensive linemen of all time. And I remember watching this one show once, and they were talking to Joe Klecko, the defensive tackle for the New York Sack Exchange New York Jets. And he said that John Hanna was the only player to knock him on his back, And he said he has a picture of him with his back dirty. He said that had never happened in his life until he met John Hanna. Just to give you a little bit of synopsis on him, this was his 13th and final season in the NFL. He had 9 Pro Bowl selections, 7 first-team All-Pro selections, and was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1991. From the University of Alabama, this dude was short and stocky, but was one of the greatest drive-blocking offensive linemen I have ever seen.
Yeah, and then just think about it in terms of him. How big of a dog that you got to be to not only to be all-decade NFL all-decade team twice. Because obviously his heyday, the 70s, sure. Okay, but then, speak to his dominance. He was all-decade for the 1980s, despite, which you just pointed out, the brother retired after the 85 season. So he only played 5 seasons. And then you got to remember, you in the 80s, you had the likes of people like Jackie Slater, Joe Jacoby,
Anthony Munoz.
We had cats
Bruce
like
Matthews,
that. Bruce Matthews. And the brother still made all-decade. So enough said. One of the greatest of all time, man, just a dog, and just was always a guy that just showed up with his hard hat and lunch bill, ready to go to work each and every day, and despite the ability of his team or wherever his team standings was.
Right. 1978, I have to bring this number up because I thought it was like one of the coolest things I had ever seen. Okay. In 1978, the Patriots had set a record which has been broken, I think, by the 2002 Ravens, I think, for the most rushing yards in a single season. They rushed as a team, for 3,156 yards, and most of those was behind John Hanna.
That's getting it done. That is getting it done. And then you think about Okay, this is kind of like in our infancy as young men, because I was born in '75. You think you're a couple of years older than me, but um, who was the running back for the Patriots in the '70s? I don't remember who he
Don't
was.
I got it
So,
listed. Sam
you know,
Cunningham was one. Sam Cunningham,
Bam,
Sam
Bam
Bam
Cunningham.
Bam Cunningham was
Oh,
the running back.
okay.
He had the most yards, 768 yards. They had Andy Johnson, Horace Ivory, and also with 539 yards rushing that year, Steve Grogan.
Okay. Okay. So other than Grogan and Bam Cunningham, have no idea who those other guys are. Never heard of them.
But that just goes to show you with this franchise prior to the arrival of Parcells and prior to the arrival of Brady and Bledsoe and all of that, you really didn't have a lot of guys with the Patriots that was well known, outside of New England, and that just kind of like the forte of the franchise, even going back to the days of the AFL, other than maybe Jim Plunkett, who was the greatest player of the Patriots up until, during that time, there wasn't not a lot of them,
Gotta be,
you
gotta
know.
be John Hanna or gotta be out of John Hanna or Mike Haynes, right?
Yeah, Mike Haynes is up there.
You
Mike
know,
Haynes. Maybe if you really squint your eyes, if like for the really older people out there, maybe John Capoletti, not John Capoletti, Babe Parilli. You know, um, the quarterback of the Patriots of the '60s. But other than that, there's not really a lot. There's not a lot. But moving on to the defense, which was the heart and soul of this team in 1985, because of some of the things that they did, especially in the postseason. You know, um, led by Julius Adams, the defensive end. He was in his 15th and final season with the Patriots. He had other guys like Kenneth Sims, Garen Veras, who was a rookie that year out of Stanford. But then the linebacking core, Don Blackman, Larry McGrew, Steve Nelson, and of course, Hall of Famer Andre Tippett.
yes, just tremendous players. Andre Tippett, then as you mentioned, Ronnie Lippett. Then we had Fred Marion, who was a very good player, as
Oh,
well as
yeah.
Roland James. And not to spin it back too much, just tidbit on offense right quick, just two quick things.
Okay.
Um, got to shout out the Baton Rouge native Stephen Starring, man.
Yes,
Got to shout
sir.
him out.
Now,
And
he
then
was a
secondly,
quarterback, wasn't he? He was a quarterback in college.
yes,
Yeah,
he was.
he was a quarterback in college.
And then you got to shout out the old dinosaur himself, because this is a just as rare as the straight ahead kicker was, is now, the barefooted kicker, Tony Franklin, because I remember he was one of the last two. It was he and Rich Carlos that used to kick
Yeah.
for the Broncos. They were the last of the barefooted kickers. But, just quick shout out to those guys,
Yeah, I
before
was going
we
to mention
focus on the
something about
defense.
Tony Franklin because I remember him with the Eagles, and he came, that was like a real odd thing, to even to see back then. But they had a few barefoot kickers back then. You named two of them. I can't think of any other off the top of my head outside of Tony Franklin and Rich Carlos. But,
Correct.
I remember watching a Monday night game when he was with Tony Franklin was with Philly, and he hit a 59-yard field goal barefoot against the Cowboys. I think the game was in Philly, and I think it was cold that night. And I was like, how can the person kick barefoot, kick a football that far in elements? Like that's a different kind of dude, and that's something that you don't see anymore. In the NFL, things that you don't really see, barefoot kickers. That's like you said. You're right. That went the way of the dinosaur. Having a
Correct.
barefoot kicker, you know. But the defense was the heart and soul of that team. The defensive backs, Raymond Claiborne, Roland James, Ronnie Lepet, and Fred Marion. Fred Marion, especially the secondary, came up huge during the playoffs, which we're going to get to. But Julius Adams, the longtime defensive end, he was in his 15th season with the Patriots. Came from the SWAC. He was from Texas Southern. Um, and just an all around again, outside of Andre Tippett, there wasn't really a lot of star power on that defense either.
Correct. And he was definitely the person that moved the needle defensively. And as we mentioned before, they had guys like Andre Lippett. He was the 85 season, he was Pro Bowl and did
Yeah.
second team All Pro. He would be either make a Pro Bowl here and there, or at minimum be in contention for a Pro Bowl nod. And then the aforementioned Fred Marion, and then just to your point, and as we alluded to earlier, the team was just built in a way to not make mistakes offensively, but then the opposite. It was almost kind of like an inverse of approach where the offense kind of played defensively in an attempt to minimize mistakes,
Yeah.
and the defense kind of played offensively
Yeah.
to try to create mistakes,
Yeah.
create turnovers, create opportunities for the offense, since the offense was kind of more limited.
Right. Now, before we move on to the regular season, and there was a lot of things that happened during the regular season that I thought were very interesting. Is there anything else you want to add to like the personnel, or anything that you want to add dealing with the personnel of the Patriots in '85?
No, we've covered it thoroughly. So
Okay. They opened the season that year at home against the Green Bay Packers, and they won that game 26-20. The following week, no one knew this at the time, but the following week was a preview of the Super Bowl. They would travel to Soldier Field, the Patriots would, to take on the Chicago Bears, and they lost to the Bears 20-7. The lone highlight of that game was a 90-yard touchdown pass from Tony Eason to Craig James, which was at the time the longest play in Patriot history. The next week, they go to Buffalo. And not only do they lose, not only do they beat the Bills, but it was a very costly win because following a sack by Bruce Smith, a young Bruce Smith, Tony Eason separates his shoulder and he's out.
wow, wow, and then it's kind of like almost where sometimes things can kind of be a blessing in disguise, because as we were talking about earlier, Tony Easton, you just don't know what you were going to get from Tony Easton. Like for example, like that game against Green Bay, 21-28, 241 yards, one touchdown, one sack, four sacks,
Yeah.
4 sacks taken. Then you go to the game versus Chicago. They were right there in the game, but then look at this: 15-35, 234 yards, one touchdown, 3 picks, took 6 sacks in that game.
Right.
So it's like you're right there, but you got this quarterback. You just don't know which way the wind is going to blow on this dude. So I could imagine from a psyche standpoint, as well as from a game planning standpoint, it could make things a bit complicated at times, because at the quarterback position, you didn't know what you were going to get. And then as a result, you didn't know what you could hang your hat on.
Yeah. I have a question about that though. Like you had on the outside, he's taking all of these sacks, right? But you have on the outside, you have Irving Fryer, you have Stephen Starring, and you have Stanley Morgan. These are three fast, really athletic receivers. I'm starting to think that a reason why he was taking a lot of sacks was because that maybe he was holding the ball too long, you know? And I went back and looked at a couple, especially the playoff game that he had. He had a tendency to, first of all, he had a really funky delivery anyway. But at the same time, he held the ball too long. And I kind of think it wasn't necessarily the scheme, because you could adjust the scheme and just run slant routes because a lot of people really weren't doing that, like talking about, you know, they weren't like slow developing routes. He was just holding the ball too long. And I think that was the reason why he was taking a lot of sacks, for him holding the ball too long.
I can concur with that to a degree, but you have to also remember the context of the game at that
Right.
particular time. Whereas the passing game has through the years, beginning with the West Coast scheme. I think the first two teams, not leaving out Air Coryell because that was not a West Coast scheme, but it
That was
was
a vertical
Bill
scheme.
Walsh, and then
Yeah.
it was Bill Walsh in San Francisco, and Sam Weish slash Forrest Gregg over there with the Sam Weish in particular once he took over because Ken Anderson, Boomer Esiason, and all that, they kind of had West Coast elements. But
Yeah.
before that, the passing game was merely an accessory
Yeah.
or a complement to the running game. And I was saying that to say that usually it wasn't like these quick passes to kind of supplement or be a substitute for the running game like they do now. It was, to your point, a la Raiders, a la Air Coryell, get the ball up the field to create explosive plays, explosive opportunities, and things like
Right.
that. So I think also part of the reason why he may have been holding on to the ball too long. Now he's a bum; he was holding on to it too long. But I think schematically, the way football was played at that time, it didn't help matters either because you're trying to get the ball down the field. Because as you mentioned, Stanley Morgan had world class speed. Urban Fry was very explosive, and they had a very, very strong running game. So they were trying to do play action off of that and get over the top. So, and those things take time. And
Right.
so, depending on the type of defensive scheme or front that you're facing, sometimes that can present some problems in terms of pressure, pressure and getting the pocket pressure.
Okay. They after they beat the Bills, they had back-to-back losses when Eason was out with the separated shoulder. They had back-to-back losses to the Raiders, and then at Cleveland, which an up and coming Cleveland Browns team with Bernie Kosar. They lost at Cleveland. Going into week 6, the Patriots were 2-3, and not really a lot of people were not really looking at them, as far as like being a competitive, or at least to being a threat in the AFC. Then all of a sudden they reel off 6 straight games, 6 straight wins under Grogan. And Grogan seemed like he found a fountain of youth, and the running game started to click, and which included a last second win over the Dolphins in Foxborough, which the last drive of that game, Grogan drives them 80 yards for the game-winning touchdown, and he found a fountain of youth in that game because the final touchdown, he ran 20 yards to score. 11th, he was in his 11th season, over 30, and he outran the Dolphins defense to get into the end zone to win 17-13, a dramatic win. The next week, they go up to Seattle, which was in the Kingdome in the mid 80s with those great Seattle Seahawks teams that a lot of people don't remember. But that was a very difficult place to play. And Grogan does it again, rallies them. They were down 17-7 at one point. They rally to beat they're down 13-7, I should say. They rallied to beat the Seahawks 20-13, but they reel off 6 straight. And next thing you know, they're right in the hunt for not only a playoff spot, for possibly, if a couple things go right, in contention to win the AFC East when nobody gave them a shot at all.
Correct. And then, as you alluded to at the beginning of the episode, the sports writer mentioned that they had a lot of talent, but they were devoid of a team personality. But now, with you put Grogan in there, now it's like all of a sudden a recipe for success becomes created, and by a byproduct of that is now personality where, like, okay, we're going to run the football. Grogan, we know what we're going to get. We just need him to make a handful of plays with his arm or his feet, even in year 11, and then we'll let our defense take care of the rest. Case in point with the Seattle game, Grogan, 15 to 27, 198 yards passing, 2 touchdowns, one interception, right? But then conversely, you look, defense creates 5 sacks. Defense creates three interceptions with Dave Craig. So I know they got some fumbles because for a
Yeah.
while he and Warren Moon were exchanging the fumble record each week,
Right.
like in the early '90s. But we got 3 there, and then even then, right? 2 of those interceptions, Fred Varian got 2 of them intact on 115 return yards.
Right.
For total for those. So that's defense creating offense for the offense, and then we just need between that running game and Steve Grogan, we just need you. We know exactly what we're going to get. We know you're not going to lose the game. We know you're not going to attempt to do too much. You're going to keep us on schedule.
Yeah.
And and then like you talk about how Easton was holding the ball too long. Kingdom, very noisy, hard place to play. Guess what? Grogan, 0 sacks.
Yep.
0 sacks. None. So he's keeping them. They're not falling behind the chains. They're staying in front of the chains. And
Right.
and then all of a sudden they've created a personality as well as a recipe for success.
Okay, now the streak ended the very next week. They lost in overtime to the Jets, and they lost on a Pat Leahy field goal. Boy, that's a name I haven't heard in a long time. Pat Leahy. Lost on a Pat Leahy overtime field goal, lost 16-13. But they had an even bigger loss in that Steve Grogan gets his leg broken. And so he's out for the remainder of the regular season with a fractured fibula. So in returns from the separated shoulder, in returns Tony Eason. And they lose on a Monday night to the Dolphins in Miami, which they always lose in Miami. But the last game of the regular season in Foxborough, they play in Cincinnati. They need the win to get in because if they lose, Denver gets in their place. Okay, so it basically comes down to when you're in. They still had a chance to get in, but they needed like a whole bunch of different things to happen if they were to lose to the Bengals. But in that game, it came down to the final 2 minutes. They're facing a 4th and less than 1 from the 42-yard line. They hand the ball off to fullback Robert Weathers, and he goes 42 yards to score to give them the lead and ultimately the win 34-23. They're in the playoffs, but you got this quarterback who just took over for a guy that led them to 6 straight wins, And so now, what do you have? So now, you don't know what you have when it comes to, Easton at quarterback heading into the playoffs. So you're going to need something else. And that something else, as we would see, would be their defense.
Correct. Now, just backing up, if I remember correctly, in terms of Denver, this is the year that they went 11-5 and missed the playoffs, right?
That's right.
Wow. And then speaking of
because the Patriots and the Broncos that year both finished 11-5, but the Broncos was the odd man out. This is to let you know how deep the AFC was, because the Patriots at 11-5 was the last team in.
Correct. And then now, even though they didn't know what you would get out of Tony Easton rather, now we've had some success. Now they had a clearly established recipe. Now they had a clearly established personality.
Right.
So now there's an explicit standard.
Yeah.
For success that must be met now. So even though we don't know what we're going to get out of Eason, whereas before you didn't know what you were going to get out of him, nor did we know what the benchmarks were. Mm-hmm. Now the benchmarks are clearly established now, where, okay, Grogan has showing you how it's done. Just, okay, we're going to run the football. We just need you to make maybe 1 or 2 plays with minimal mistakes, and then we're going to rely on the defense to kind of create offensive opportunities for us, like through turnover creation, through pressure in the pocket, through flipping the field, things like that. That's what we're going to rely on. And that formula, not to get ahead of the horse, that formula came up in spades in the playoffs.
Exactly. Now, let's take a look at the AFC playoff picture that year in 1985. The Raiders had the number one seed. They finished the year at 12-4. They had the tiebreaker over the Miami Dolphins, which was the 2 seed, who also finished at 12-4. The 3rd seed was the Cleveland Browns with a record of 8-8. And the reason why they got the 3rd seed because they won the absolutely dreadful AFC Central. Okay, because everybody in that division was like not really great. You know, you had the Steelers who was still, trying to rebuild, the Bengals who was so up and down in the 80s, and then you had the Houston Oilers. I think this was Warren Moon's 2nd year in the NFL, the 2nd year with the Oilers. This is the Marion Campbell era Oilers. So, so it was just, the AFC Central was not really that good. The 4th seed was the New York Jets at 11-5, and the Patriots rounding out the playoff field in the AFC also at 11-5. And the Jets had the tiebreaker over the Patriots that year, and the Patriots ultimately, as we said, ultimately had the tiebreaker over the Broncos, who also finished 11-5.
Correct. And then they got in, and then like a lot of times, to your point, because obviously the AFC was dreadful at Central rather. And, remember the Steelers had Mark Malone at quarterback and Walter Abercrombie at running back, man. Garbage, man. And then the only good player they had offensively was where they had two good players. Mike Webster was still the center, and they had Louis Phillips. Outside of that, everything else on offense was garbage. But anyway,
if you remember the year before, in 1984, the John Stallworth
made the AFC title game.
Yeah, John Stallworth had basically was born again, as a receiver, and he had like a career year in 1984. So they still had weapons, but the Steelers just really dropped off in 1984, from playing in the AFC Championship game the year before. Then you got the wild card game. Saturday, December 28th, 1985, at Giant Stadium. And I did not realize this, but this was the very first playoff game in Giant Stadium. And it's the Jets playing it, not the Giants, which I thought was very interesting.
Well, so help me out here, because I know that prior to the Jets becoming tenants of the old Meadowlands, that they used to play their home games at Shea Stadium.
At Shea Stadium, yes.
So prior to
they didn't start playing. They didn't start playing at Giant Stadium until '84.
Yeah, I know that. But you said the very first playoff game in Giant Stadium. I thought that this is '84 though. So I thought the Giants were playing road playoff games. Right. LT got it. Yeah. Okay. Got it.
Because the Giants played their first. Because what was so funny was that the Giants would play their first home playoff game at Giant Stadium the very next day against the 49ers. Okay,
shout out Rob Carpenter.
Yep, exactly. That was the Rob Carpenter, the Van Pelt days, of the Giants. The young Phil Simms, and I think who was the other quarterback? Was it Rutledge? Who was the quarterback? Or no, it wasn't.
It was Jeff Rutledge from Alabama. He and Tony Nathan wound up being on this same high school team or something in Alabama. I remember that. They got a great movie about that, by the way.
Yeah.
But man. So, but they had a clearly established formula, man, to win, and they went up to the Jets, who edged them out at 11-5, and they got it done. And they kind of followed that formula to a T, if I recollected that game, and all of that. You can go through the particulars of the stats.
Okay, Patriots ended up winning the game 26-14. It was, like I said, the very first postseason game at Giant Stadium. The Patriots would record 5 sacks and 4 turnovers in the game. Tony Franklin kicked 4 field goals, but there were 2 very key plays in this game. In the second quarter, a 36-yard touchdown pass from Tony Eason to Stanley Morgan to give the Patriots a 13-7 lead. Then in the fourth quarter, Johnny Rember recovered a fumble on the second half opening kickoff by Johnny Hector and returned it 15 yards for a touchdown. And for me, that was particularly interesting because Johnny Hector is from my hometown of New Iberia, Louisiana. I think he still has most of the rushing records at my high school. Still, all these years later, he graduated from New Iberia Senior High in 1979, and I think he still has most of the rushing records there. So, and we're talking 40 years later, almost 50 years later, he still has most of the rushing records there. With the win, they win 26-14. And it was a windy, dreary, cold day at Giant Stadium. Of course, the wind in Giant Stadium was always swirling. It was the first Patriots postseason win since 1963, which I thought was amazing. They beat the Buffalo Bills that day in Buffalo, to go to the AFL Championship game in '63, where they got demolished by my Chargers. But I just wanted to bring that up. But really, to your point, Tony Eason, 12 of 16 for 179 yards, 1 touchdown. I didn't record how many sacks he took, but it really wasn't much. And
he took 3.
He took 3 sacks. He took 3 sacks in that game, which. Okay, that's acceptable for that time period against that defense. That's acceptable. But still, very economical, stayed within the game plan, and let the defense win. And the offense pretty much held it together, didn't make the big mistake, didn't try to do too much. They just stayed within the game plan, and they got it done.
And there you have it, because, as we've always talked about through the years, regardless of sport, more times than not, especially in team sports, times than not, more games are lost than they are won.
Right.
Most of the time. You just try not to lose the game. And if you can lose the game and play a relatively clean game, you got a chance, and that's exactly what they did. They played a clean game. They created 5 turnovers. They intercepted Pat Ryan 3 times. They intercepted Ken O'Brien another 2 times, and then let's see, they had another. I'm sorry, they intercepted them once apiece, and then you combine that with the special team return, which led directly to a touchdown. You got at least 7 points off turnovers there, and you're up. You got 3 turnovers in your back pocket, and then they threw 5 sacks. They threw 5 sacks atop that, and then you throw in, let's see what we got. Then you throw in nothing to write home about in terms of running yards, but they had like nearly 40 rushes. They had nearly 40 rushes for right at 100 yards, but you're controlling the clock. They won time of possession 31-47 to 28-13. And that's a recipe to advance in the playoff every single time.
Right. So the next week, January 5th, 1986, they go to L.A. to face the Raiders. And a lot of people are saying, okay, the Patriots won a game. They're going to L.A. They're going to face the Raiders in Los Angeles. You got to deal with Marcus Allen and that great defense and Mark Wilson, And at the same time, the Patriots are coming in there pretty much playing with house money. Anything that happens is gravy because nobody even expected them to get this far. Okay, but they go to the LA Coliseum, and thanks to 6 Raider turnovers and 20 points off of those turnovers, the Patriots pull off the 27-20 upset win over the LA Raiders, thanks in large part to two people. Craig James, 23 carries, 104 yards. But at the same time, the defense, along with special teams star Jim Bowman, who recovered a muff punt in the first quarter and recovered a another muff punt, but this time, but in the second half, recovered it in the end zone for a touchdown to give them the lead, and then the defense did the rest, holding the Raiders scoreless for the entire fourth quarter. So forcing Marcus Allen to fumble once. The Patriots defense was starting to gain a reputation as being ball hawks. Forcing turnovers, stripping the ball. They had stripped it and forced a lot of turnovers in the regular season. But here in the playoffs, it started becoming their calling card here in the 1985 playoffs.
And once again, same formula. Let's Tony Easton, 7 of 14, 117 yards.
Yeah.
One touchdown, biggest stat, 0 interceptions. That's very pedestrian. But if you're going to force 6 turnovers, 2 of which were on special teams and 1 led directly to a touchdown, you can win that ball game. And then, more importantly, to a theme that I said earlier, remember, like the dynamic with Easton due to his draft status, they preferred to play Easton ahead of the established Steve Grogan. Same thing was going on in Los Angeles, remember?
Right.
They had drafted Mark Wilson from BYU. Now, you got Jim Plunkett on the bench, who all he's done is win 2 Super Bowls for you in Super Bowl 15 over the Eagles and Super Bowl 18 over the Skins.
Which is just 2 years earlier. All
he's done is put 2 Lombardies in your trophy case, yet that's still not enough because Al, he loves his vertical passing game. He wants to get Mark Wilson in there. Now he could throw it a mile, but he's going to throw it to the wrong color jersey every single time. Look at these stats: 11 to 27, $135, 1 touchdown, 3 interceptions. You're not going to win like that.
Not in the playoffs.
One seed.
Yeah, not in the playoffs. Not if you're the number 1 seed. Yeah, you're playing at home, but you're playing against a defense that's very opportunistic. With that Patriots defense, they're very opportunistic. They're not going to make mistakes. And this particular afternoon on January 5th, 1986, they didn't make any mistakes. And to your point earlier, their defense, the Patriots defense, was essentially their offense. Now, the offense, again, very pedestrian. You look at Easton's numbers. He's not going to blow you away with statistics in this game. He just wasn't, But the defense did what they needed to do, and they did not make the key mistakes. They held the ball. They kept the Raiders from scoring. In fact, not only did they keep the Raiders off the scoreboard in the fourth quarter, they kept them off the scoreboard for the entire second half. They shut out the Raiders in the second half. They had a chance to tie the game. They had 3 chances. They had 3 possessions in the fourth quarter. Their possessions ended like this: punt, a Fred Marion interception, and a turnover on downs. That's how their offense was in the fourth quarter. The 3 offensive possessions for the Raiders in the fourth quarter were a punt, a Fred Marion interception, and a turnover on downs. That's defense, So they upset the Raiders, right? So now they got to confront their past. Now they got to confront what was called the Orange Bowl jinx. And to take a step back, okay, 1985, right? Everybody remembers the most ballyhooed, the most talked about regular season game that year was the Bears-Dolphins game on Monday Night Football when the Bears were trying to go undefeated and the Dolphins snapped that streak. And everybody was salivating. Could we have a Bears-Dolphins Super Bowl in Super Bowl 20? Dolphins were in the Super Bowl the year before and got smacked around by the 49ers. Now they have a chance to go back to the Super Bowl. Young Dan Marino at quarterback, playing against this relative unknown team from Foxborough that's within their division. And I kind of, now thinking about it, I kind of equate it to something that happened earlier that very same year in college basketball when you had Georgetown play against Villanova. Whereas if Georgetown would have played anybody else, Georgetown would have won by 20, 30 points. But since you had that familiarity between Villanova and Georgetown, that nervousness was gone. You weren't as nervous because you knew what you were going up against. And I think the same thing was the case here, whereas the Patriots knew what Dan Marino could do. They had beat them earlier that year. They came in with some confidence that they could beat the Dolphins, but they had to deal with history, knowing that they had lost 18 straight games heading into that game at the Orange Bowl. Haven't won there since the Dolphins' inaugural season of 1966. So you're talking about not only you had to beat Dan Marino and the Marx Brothers, but you also had to deal with history as well.
Correct. And man, that comparison to Georgetown Villanova is apt. But man, please don't get me started on John Thompson, man. But but today is
we got a future episode talking about the Big East, so you got plenty of time to talk about John Thompson.
Don't get me started on John Thompson, man. But anyway, your point is very apt. It's because like a lot of times when you get into the tournament, you just want to get into the tournament, the playoffs, and it's about who's playing well at the right time. You don't necessarily have to be the best team, but in a playoff, especially a winner-take-all scenario, if I'm better than you that day, to your point, Georgetown would have beaten anyone else by 20 points. They probably would have beaten Villanova too by 20 points. But on that particular day, Villanova was better. Guess what? Villanova national champions. Same thing here in football. We just have to be better today. Let's not worry about, even though we had several prior misfortune at the Orange Bowl. Let's worry about today. Let's be better today. Let's play clean today. We got a shot, and lo and behold, guess what? Boom. There you go, and that's exactly what they did. Fill us in with the particulars.
Okay, that afternoon, and I'm gonna be honest. Okay, I can sit there and tell you, in my life, going back to 1980, AFC Championship game, Raiders and Chargers. I could go back to that. And from that one all the way up to last year's AFC Championship game, I could essentially tell you who I was with, where I was, and everything about every AFC and NFC Championship game, except this one. I remember I went back and watched this game a couple weeks ago in preparation for this, about a week ago. I went back and watched this game on YouTube. I have no recollection of this game at all. I remember the Rams-Bears NFC Championship game, which was the earlier that afternoon. That was like the 1 o'clock game. And this was the late game in Miami because the game pretty much was played mostly at night. And I have no recollections of that game at all. I don't know if I was sick or if I was somewhere else and didn't see the game or whatever. I have no recollection of this game at all. But anyway, Patriots ended up winning this game, essentially going away 31-14, ended the 18-game losing streak, winning for the first time, and boy, was it a big win, winning in an Orange Bowl for the first time since 1966. And it was by far the best game played by the Patriots all year. 255 yards rushing in the game. Let's see. Patriots ended up leading 17-7 at the half. First play of the game, New England defensive end Garen Veras stripped Tony Nathan of the ball and then led to a Tony Franklin field goal. Then after a Dolphins touchdown, Patriots scored two unanswered touchdowns by two touchdown passes from Tony Eason. A 4-yard pass to Tony Collins and a 1-yard touchdown pass to tight end Derek Ramsey. And then on the ensuing kickoff, after leading to start the second half, Lorenzo Hampton fumbles it. Eason throws another touchdown pass, his third touchdown pass of the day, to Robert Weathers to make the score 24-7, and essentially from that point the game's over. Miami committed 6 turnovers in this game. The Dolphins would add like a meaningless touchdown late in the fourth quarter, but the damage was done. The Patriots go to the Orange Bowl, not only in the streak, in the Orange Bowl jinx, but at the same time, punch a ticket to Super Bowl 20. In this postseason, Chuck, the Patriots forced 16 postseason turnovers, second most in NFL history, only behind the 1977 Dallas Cowboys, who had 18 turnovers in their postseason run, heading to winning Super Bowl 12. Incidentally, ironically, also took place in the Superdome. But once again, the Patriots did what they had to do. The Patriots played probably their best game of the season at the time they most needed it. And then Eason had his best game of the year, passing for 3 touchdowns in that game in the crucial AFC clinching win.
Well, first of all, you had a good day at the office if your defense is being compared to the old 77 Doomsday Tom Landry flex defense.
Yep.
You've had a good day at the office if people are comparing you to those guys who were legendary. But, once again, the recipe, as you laid out most of the particulars, 255 yards rushing, they were plus 4 turnovers. 2 penalties for 15 yards.
Yeah.
Huge. Then time of possession, especially with Dan Marino, basically 40 minutes to 20 minutes for time of possession, which is huge. And then, as you mentioned before, Tony Eason, 10-12, 71 yards, 3 touchdowns. We don't need you to do a whole lot, but when we call on you, dude, we just walk to the mailbox and get the check out of the mail. That's all we need you to do, and he was able to punch it in, when we called upon with 3 touchdowns. So the game played out perfectly for them because the way the game unfolded with the defense and the turnovers and the running game, they mitigated that risk of the volatility of Eason's level of play. They mitigated that risk all the way to 0, basically,
right?
Because he didn't have to do much. Just do when 12 attempts, 3 touchdowns, just 71 yards, and you win going away. And I agree with you. It was their best game of the whole season. Now, I know on the other side that the Bears were just like breathing a sigh of relief because, as you alluded to in that earlier Monday night matchup, they kind of Don Shula and Dan Marino and you remember Jim Jensen? I used to love him.
Yeah, Jim Jensen.
They had the recipe of what teams would kind of follow in the coming years to kind of troubleshoot their 4-6 front, quick passes out into the flats, force those safeties to cover, force them to kind of make tackles in space, and then you hope for the best. And even though the Bears were a team of destiny, it definitely made things a lot easier not having to face the Dolphins, who seemingly the previous time that they played had a recipe for success.
Yeah, I think that would have been like a really interesting Super Bowl had the Dolphins got there, because you would have had essentially the personification of the old, the irresistible force against the immovable object type of scenario with the Dolphins offense. And I think they would have had, the best defense, the best offense to counteract that 46 defense was the short passing game, was like a West Coast style offense. Now, of course, that wasn't Miami's strong suit, but what's the old famous line by Bum Phillips about Don Shula? He could take yours and beat his, and then take his and beat yours. So but give Don Shula 2 weeks, against that defense, he'll figure it out. Definitely he would figure it out because Don Shula was still at the top of his game in the mid '80s with Dan Marino, But it would have been a very interesting Super Bowl to say the least. But what we got instead was the Bears against the Patriots in Super Bowl 20, and unfortunately, it was just the only thing that I wish I would have seen in the Super Bowl was Walter Payton score a touchdown. I'm still kind of mad about that they gave it to the Fridge and the Fridge scored, but Walter Payton didn't. If anybody, I don't care if I'm at the 1 yard line, I'm giving the ball to Sweetness 4 times out of 4. If it's fourth and 2 inches, and I'm giving it to Walter because Walter got to score. Sweetness got to score, and I thought that was like, why give it to him? Give it to Walter 5 times. Just get him into the end zone. That's how I felt.
And I agree with that. And it was just so corny.
Yeah, it was
so corny. It was just so corny to do that. You know what I mean? And I know at the time because, we got to remember the '80s. It was just like an explosion in pop culture. And for that particular short time and for that season, the Bears transcended the NFL as well as the Fridge as well. So he was kind of like a pop icon for a very, very brief period of time. But, common sense and loyalty and some type of good ethics should have prevailed. And
right.
It's just not and even if you put the call in, I know it's Mike Ditka and all of that. I'm Jim McMahon. Hey, Fridge, open up a hole. Because you're not about to get it. We're changing this. And you can cuss me out all you want. And but it was just Super Bowl was over with before it started. But nonetheless, a very pleasant showing for the Patriots. And you're like, okay, they lost, but perhaps they could make another run, if Easton could take a step forward, perhaps, which was very iffy and then obviously he didn't, and the rest is history.
This Super Bowl is very notable for something, and I don't think there's a Super Bowl we've had since then that we have this. And I thought it was very interesting. This is the first Super Bowl for sure. And if I'm not mistaken, the only one where you had 2 head coaches that were in the Hall of Fame as players squaring off in the Super Bowl as coaches. I don't think we've ever had that since then. I know we hadn't had it before. We didn't have it before, but we certainly hadn't had it since. With Raymond Berry on one side and Mike Ditka on the other side, and both of them were in the Hall of Fame as players.
I doubt that very seriously too. And that was just crazy. And then, as you mentioned before, they were the complete antithesis of one another. Whereas Raymond Berry was very laid back, calm demeanor, highly poised, and kind of like me and you a little bit, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's the opposite. Where he's very volatile, very confrontational, etc., very boisterous, etc., etc., etc.
Now, at the end of the game, the game's over, the days after the Super Bowl, there is some aftermath dealing with the New England Patriots, and it was being reported by the Boston Globe that several players indulged in drugs during the season and maybe even during the Super Bowl leading or days leading up to the Super Bowl. But that story, I had heard about it, but I think that story was way overblown. But at the same time, there was something to that. Maybe you could explain it, what was going on with that, thanks to what was being reported at the time in the Boston Globe.
Well, Boston Globe, and I wonder was this Bob Ryan had anything to do with this, but who knows? But Boston Globe at the time, drug scandal surfaced after the Super Bowl 20 loss. They mentioned that during the season, 6 players admitted to Raymond Berry, the head coach, that they used drugs during the season, most notably Irvin Fryer, Tony Collins, Steven Starr, and Kenneth Sims, Roland James, and Raymond Claiborne. Now, also, according to the article, they reportedly were all clean leading up to the weeks of the Super Bowl as well as for the Super Bowl. So perhaps they're because there was a lot of the defensive some of the defensive players on here, and it just seemed like perhaps the lack of drug use corresponded with, even though they had played well throughout the season, perhaps it corresponded with them playing at a near legendary level in the playoffs. Perhaps I'm just speculating, and I think to your point, I agree with you as well that it's probably overblown because 70s and 80s, everybody, athletes on that booger sugar was quite prominent.
It was like it was very prominent, but at the same time, conversely, if looking at it from the other end, it was like right at the height of the just say no era in society, and so maybe, with it being reported that there was some drug use involved, that maybe, just maybe, it might have been some kind of a contributing factor of their poor showing in the Super Bowl, which I highly doubt, because they could have been completely clean or completely doped up or whatever. It wouldn't have made a difference dealing with the Chicago Bears of 1985, But I really do believe that was way overblown, and and for what I remember of this, it was pretty much gone before it really got any kind of traction in society, because it was like, yeah, it might have happened, but then again, it might have not happened. But what difference does it really make after all? They got blasted in the Super Bowl. Who really cares? And I think that's what the general consensus was with a lot of fans around the country. The Patriots lost, quote unquote, might not have shouldn't have even been there, by their showing, but still, but still in all, the Patriots got there, and they had one of the most memorable postseason runs ever. 3 playoff wins, first team in NFL history to win 3 road playoff games en route to a Super Bowl. That's quite of an accomplishment. As a wild card, the Raiders won 3 to get to Super Bowl 15, but their game against the Oilers was actually in Oakland. So the Patriots did one better by winning all 3 of their games on the road, which is something that had never happened before.
Yeah, and I agree with you, because you got to remember the time in the society that, everything, like how everything is a story now. Back then, certain things you hear things, it's like, whatever. And then, just a little tidbit, you mentioned the Just Say No campaign engineered by Nancy Reagan. Remember, she was the spokesperson for that, and you famously remember she had the different strokes episode with Just Say No with Anna Jackson. And then the irony of it is that, Gary Coleman, Todd Bridges, who played Willis, as well as Dana Plato, who played Kimberly, they all was snorting that booger sugar. That's the irony of the entire thing.
That's right. That's right.
But in terms of the Patriots run, not only did they win 3 road playoff games, but they beat 3 double-digit win opponents in doing so. Because normally, and you would be hard pressed to find anyone.
And the last 2 AFC champions.
Correct, and you would be hard pressed to find anyone that have had a Super Bowl run beating 3 double-digit win teams en route to the Super Bowl, let alone doing it all on the road.
That's right.
Kudos to the 85 Patriots.
Right. And so we're going to end this part of the show on that, with us talking about the 1985 Patriots, but we're going to come back, take a short break, and we're going to come back to send a shout out to somebody who was very, very instrumental in that 1985 run. And up until Tom Brady showed up, maybe the greatest quarterback in Patriots history. We're going to talk about him in a bit, and we're going to send him a much, much deserved shout out. Right after this short break, you're listening to the Historically Speaking Sports podcast here on the Sports History Network. And we're back here on the Historically Speaking Sports podcast here on the Sports History Network, the place where we bring you the best of sports from back in the day. I'm Dana Augusta, along with Charles Combs, and we're going to end the show as we always do by sending a shout out to somebody that is related to the subject at hand. And tonight's shout out goes to none other than the man who made neck rolls cool for quarterbacks, Mr. Steve Grogan. Now, that is something that you don't really see anymore in the NFL, is players wearing neck rolls. I know I wore a neck roll when I played junior high and high school football. I wore a neck roll because I thought they were cool, and plus I was a fullback. So, I kind of needed it. But with Grogan as a quarterback wearing a neck roll, it was kind of weird to see toward the end of his career because he had a couple of neck injuries. But still in all, when he came into the league in 1975 from Kansas State, he was something of an anomaly. You had mobile quarterbacks such as Roger Staubach and Bobby Douglas in Chicago, and Steve Grogan kind of fit into that. He was a fifth-round pick by the Patriots in 1975. He was a dual-threat quarterback in a league of pocket passers. And as a running back, he had a series of great rushing years as well as passing years. He ran for a career record 12 touchdowns in 1976, and the 76 Patriots is particularly interesting because that was his first year as a full-time starter. To start the season after losing to the Colts in the first game, they won 3 straight against the likes of against the Miami Dolphins, the Pittsburgh Steelers, and the Oakland Raiders in 3 consecutive wins in 1976, which catapulted them to the division title. And in that Raider game, he beat the Raiders 48-17, which handed the Raiders their worst loss since 1963. And then in 1976, he finished with 18 touchdown passes and 12 rushing touchdowns in 1976. And Chuck, I know as a quarterback now, he would be, and just watching games earlier today, he's sort of like Josh Allen in a way, because he was not afraid to run it. Now it could be argued that Josh Allen runs too much, but the same could be said about Steve Grogan in the in the 70s, because quarterbacks was not asked to run as much as they are asked to run now.
I could see that. I could see the Josh Allen comparisons, minus the excuses, obviously. Because, whatever Steve Grogan loses, he just loses. Whatever Josh Allen loses is always, they had a whatever. They had a media during the game or something. Every time he loses, is some excuse why he lost. But anyway, he would probably do very, very well in today's game because he was quite versed. And then you got to think with the decreased physicality, he was a dual threat quarterback in those days.
Right.
Playing the likes Doomsday, Oakland Raider defense, Purple People Leaders, Steel Curtain, guys like that, where it would just open mayhem and open season on anyone, including the quarterback position. So he probably would be very, very successful now. Now, one of the worst Super Bowl quarterbacks on Nintendo Entertainment System ever, but that was for the 1990 season. So he's well past. He was ancient by then. But 2 quick questions. Well, one quick question for you, because the first question I was going to ask you was going to be how you felt he would fare today. You kind of just alluded to that just a moment ago. But secondly, mainly for me and perhaps our listeners, even though I know a lot about football, I played Sandlot. I never played organized wide because I'm a basketball player.
Yeah.
That. What is the point of the neck roll? What does it do? The preventive measures and things like that.
For somebody, is basically gives you more neck stability, especially for people that run the ball a lot or defensive backs. You don't really see it too much now. Okay, you just, for whatever reason, you don't see it much now. But back in the 80s, a lot of people wore them to give yourself a little bit more stability on your neck to keep your head from moving back and forth, from getting hit, like jarring hits and putting a lot of stress on your neck. So that's what neck rolls were for, like famous, like for example, Jim Otto for the Oakland Raiders, the longtime center for the Raiders, wore one. Hall of Fame offensive lineman Ron Mix of the Chargers wore one. But it basically what it does, it just gives you like a little bit stability on your neck from getting, like if you like head on collisions, and your neck might go one side or to the other, and it just gives you like a little bit more of a stability on your neck to keep your head from flopping from one side to another too much.
Okay. Okay. Got it. So, thanks for filling that in. And then
Yep.
there's also another thing that you mentioned. Well, we wanted to talk about. You mentioned, leading up to the show, just to fill you in, the listeners rather, you know,
Uh-huh.
before we took the air tonight, you mentioned that perhaps the '85 Patriots are the worst Super Bowl participant. Do you believe that, or is that your opinion? Because I don't quite agree, but who, if not them, then who?
Well, I mean, the worst is very subjective. Um, the Patriots are one of the worst, if not the worst. Unfortunately, the other team that I would consider the worst Super Bowl participant would be my Chargers in '94, because they just got hammered in the Super Bowl, and it was almost as if they they did put up a little bit of a fight, but at the same time, they were just so overly matched by that 49er team in Super Bowl 29. And I told the story here on the podcast once that that night was the loneliest night of my life as a student at Southern University, sitting in my dorm in the lobby at the dorm Super Bowl party, and I am the only person in the entire dorm, the lobby of the dorm, that wore any Charger paraphernalia, any kind of Charger gear. I was the only one, and everybody else were either 49er fans or they just didn't care. I was the only one openly rooting for the Chargers, and I felt so alone. And that was the longest night of my life as a fan.
Okay, well, I got you. Well, I got two teams in particular. I think exceed
Okay.
both the '94 Chargers as well as the '85 Patriots. I would say number one, it would have to be out of these two teams. The '79 Rams that had Vince Ferragamo, Wendell
No.
Tyler. They played the
I,
Steelers. You
I
don't think so?
vehemently disagree. Vehemently disagree. But go ahead.
9-7 or something like that, man. The only thing you remember from them is Jack Youngblood played with a broken leg. Other than that, they didn't do nothing else. But they win the game for the most part because the Steelers played unlike themselves for the first 2.5 quarters, and then finally kind of got themselves back to their normal standard of play and kind of pulled away towards the end. Okay, second candidate, 2000 New York Giants,
Yes,
Terry Collins against the
they were bad.
Ravens.
They were bad. They were the worst. They up there with the Chargers and Patriots. But that '79 Rams team, no. Here's why. Yeah, they had so many disadvantages heading into that game. It wasn't even funny. One, yeah, they had the worst record of any team to play in the Super Bowl. They were 9-7, and they made the Super Bowl. They had actually a very easy route to the Super Bowl. They beat a beat up Cowboys team, and that was the game that Jack Youngblood broke his leg, okay, against the Cowboys. And they ended up winning that game on a long pass from Ferragamo to Billy Waddy to win that game. Then they go to Tampa with the Cinderella Buccaneers, and they beat them 9-0. They didn't score a touchdown. They should have lost that game, honestly. But one thing that you have to remember about this Rams team, they scared the crap out the Steelers. And the Rams had the lead going into the fourth quarter, as opposed to the other ones, the Giants, the Chargers, and the Patriots. They never had the lead. They were never even in the game. Now, granted, this was not the strongest of the Steeler teams, they were not the strongest Steeler team to win the Super Bowl. It could be argued that they were the weakest of the 4 championship Steeler teams of the 70s. But at the same time, the Rams was game enough to beat them. I really do believe that they were game enough to beat them. They had a better shot with Ferragamo at quarterback than they had with Pat Hayden. They really did. Ferragamo was a much better quarterback than Pat Hayden ever was, But they had, with Wendell Tyler and Billy Waddy and Drew Hill and, they had a very solid team. The secondary was a little bit suspect as you would see in the fourth quarter of Super Bowl 14, but still in all, I think that the Rams Super Bowl 14 was an underrated great Super Bowl. And I think the Rams made it so. Now, would they have, in the legitimacy, could they have beaten the Steelers? Really not. But as far as them being one of the worst Super Bowl teams, I don't think so. I really don't.
Okay.
They were way more competitive than people thought they would be.
Now, I'm a big boxing fan, and what you just said is the equivalent of where he was winning the fight until he wasn't. He was ahead. He was ahead on the scores cards after 8, but then he got knocked out in the 9th. Man, come on now.
No, he basically was ahead of. Let's just say if this was a fight and it went 12 rounds, he was ahead on points going into the 11th round, and then going into the 11th, and in the 11th round he got knocked out. That's what But to say that they were the worst team, come on, Chuck. I don't think the Rams were that bad. They were not as bad as the Patriots, and they were not as bad as the Giants. If I were to put them in order, the Giants probably was the worst. The Giants, when they played the Ravens in Super Bowl 35, that's the worst. Then the Patriots, then the Chargers, then the Rams. And then no, I wouldn't even put the Rams. I would put the Falcons when they played the Broncos.
Oh, they were bad. I forgot about the Dirty Bird Falcons.
The
98. They were
the
bad.
98 Falcons, which at least the Rams were 9-7. The Falcons that year were 13-3. They had no excuse. Let's ask Eugene Robinson what happened. Anyway,
he tricking before the Super Bowl.
Exactly. Exactly.
Dude, a sucker, man. For real, man. How you gonna trick before the Super Bowl, man? These dudes, you at the top of the food chain. But anyway, I could diatribe about that all night. So okay, but you raise up very valid points. Very valid points.
Yep. But this is why we do this, y'all. This is why we do this. We have debates like this all the time whenever we're on the phone, and this is just a little sampling of our phone calls and some of our debates, which have been legendary over the years, and this is just a taste of it right here, folks. But if there's anything else, man, I think this was a very good show.
Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed myself, and then I even learned something new today because I did not know that Drew Hill played with the Rams first before he went to the Oilers. I did not know that. So learned something new today.
That's it.
So, yeah, very, very good episode, and it was wonderful to kind of revisit the 85 Patriots. Hard to believe that was 40 years ago, man.
40 years ago.
Wow.
This is another reason why I wanted to talk about them. 40-year anniversary of the Patriots and their very first Super Bowl appearance. So with that being said, I want to thank Chuck once again for joining us here on this episode. And we'll be right back after these messages to close everything out here on the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast, right here on the Sports History Network.
Thank you once again for joining us here on this episode of the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast. This podcast, of course, comes to you from the Bill King Memorial Studio in the sports wing of TM4 Enterprises, located in suburban Atlanta in the shadow of Stone Mountain. Once again, I'd like to thank my partner in crime, Charles Combs, for joining us on this great episode. And please don't forget to like and subscribe to this show wherever you get your podcast. It really helps us out, helps out the algorithm and all of that good stuff. And once again, don't forget to tell your people about it. Tell your family, tell your friends, tell your coworkers, tell your neighbor. Hell, tell a passerby on the street you think if they like sports history. And once again, until next time, peace. And also, if I don't hear from you before then, have a very, very Merry Christmas.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com. Hey there, sports history fan. This is Arnie Chapman, a.k.a. the Football History Dude, and I hope that you enjoyed this recent episode presented by the Sports History Network and were able to learn some good old-fashioned sports history knowledge nuggets. I started the Sports History Network back in 2020 with the mission to help podcasters find a community of like-minded sports history nerds, as well as helping aspiring podcasters to start their own shows. We have a little bit over 30 shows on the network right now covering all sorts of sports history, but as far as I'm concerned, we're just at the toothpick in the ocean moment, that can't even figure it out because there's so much more coming. We wanted to create the ultimate headquarters for sports yesteryear, starting with Podcast Network and our website, but we're going to continue to move into other mediums as well. And here's the cool part, because we want you to be part of our team. So if you're interested in starting your own podcast, or maybe being a guest on one of our shows, or who knows, maybe even writing an article for us over on the website. Seriously, all you gotta do is reach out to us on the contact page over at sportshistorynetwork.com. You can be as technologically savvy as a Neanderthal tapping on a stone trying to figure out this whole hieroglyphics thing back in the day. Again, it doesn't matter, because even if you don't understand the whole podcast space, we have a production team that can pretty much help you out with doing everything. All you gotta do, head over to sportshistorynetwork.com, head to the contact page, fill it out. That message goes right to me, and I'll reach out to you as soon as I can. But for now, dude, I'm through if you're through.